Hello class, welcome to Unit 4, Functions. This lesson, or rather this unit, will be all about functions. Functions are one of the most fundamental and important topics that you're going to learn in math. In all your future math classes that you take, you're going to be inundated with functions. So it's good to begin to get acquainted with them. Okay, so obviously to start off, we're going to ask, what is a function? Well, at the most basic general level, a function is, let's call it a formal relationship between an input and an output. So that's the most basic general definition of a function, and that's really all it is. A formal relationship. By formal, I mean there has to be a particular rule associated with it, and it has to have an input and it has to have an output. In particular, the output has to depend on the input, and you're going to have to be careful being able to distinguish between what is the input and what is the output. So let's jump into some examples. All right, so let's consider this example. Let's consider a job, right? So we can consider a job as a function. We can call it a function, the input being hours worked and the output being money. Make sense? So let's say you have a job. You have a job, and let's say you're paid, let's say $10 an hour. You're paid $10 per hour. So your paycheck is a function of the hours you work. So what would be the input of a function of this function? The input here would be hours worked. The output would be the money in your check. So why is it important to recognize that the input is the hours worked and the output is the money in your check? Why is it not the other way around? The question we want to ask ourselves is, what is dependent? What is dependent and what depends on what? Obviously, the money in your check depends on the number of hours you work, right? It's not the case that the number of hours you work is decided by the money in your check, right? Rather, the money in your check is determined by the hours you work. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. Let's do a bit more work here. Let's continue to explore this job. Let's say you have a job, you're still getting paid $10 per hour, right? We're going to call our function the rule that takes the hours worked as its input and returns the money in your check as an output. So for example, if you work 1 hour, you get how much in your check? You get $10, right? If you work 2 hours, you get how much in your check? You get $20. If you work, let's take it up a notch. If you work 30 hours, you get $30 in your check, right? So in this case, the input of 1 hour is associated with the output of $10. The input of 2 hours is associated with the output of $20. And the input of 30 hours is associated with the output of $30. So that's one simple example of a function. Let's take a look at another very simple example. So this is going to be sort of a different kind of example. So functions can also be very, very simple. Let's consider this a function. Let's consider the number of presidential elections per year. We're going to consider the number of presidential elections per year. This is a very simple function, right? Let's just take a look at a couple years that have happened pretty similarly, or rather pretty recently. Let's take a look at these sets of years. Let's take a look at the year 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, and let's stop at 2021. Okay, so obviously the number of presidential elections in any given year in the United States depends on what the year is, right? The input is going to be which year we're talking about. The output is going to be the number of presidential elections in that year. And this is a very simple function. If we input the year 2015, how many presidential elections were there? There were 0. If we input the year 2016, how many presidential elections were there? There was 1. How many elections were there in 2017? 0. How many elections in 2018, presidential elections, that is, 0. How many presidential elections in 2019? 0. How many presidential elections will there be in 2020? There will be 1. And how many presidential elections will there be in 2021? There will be 0. So this is a function. You might not maybe think it is at first because it's such a simple relationship. But remember, a function is just a formal relationship that associates an input with an output. In this case, there are really an infinite number of inputs, right? We can keep inputting different years, but every single year, the output is either going to be 0 or 1. In particular, it'll be 1 every 4 years, it'll be 0 every other year. So functions can also be just that simple too.